The spring melt came early to the Green River Valley in 1837, and with it came a problem that would have broken lesser men. Thomas Brennan stood knee-deep in the rushing water, his hands raw from the cold, watching silver flashes of cutthroat trout surge upstream in numbers he'd never seen in 15 years of frontier living. The spawning run was a blessing, they said, a gift from Providence. 3 weeks of fishing that could feed a man through summer and into fall, if he knew how to take advantage of it. But Thomas knew what the others were just beginning to understand. This blessing had teeth. The temperature was climbing fast, unseasonably warm for April, and the nearest trading post with salt barrels was 140 miles northeast through country still thick with winter-hungry grizzlies. He had no ice. The mountain snow was melting too fast, turning to slush before noon, and he had more fish than any man could eat in a month. Thomas pulled another trout from his weir, a beautiful 18-inch male with a hooked jaw and spots like scattered gold coins. It fought in his hands with that peculiar strength of wild things, then went still. He added it to the growing pile on the bank. 27 fish now. The sun wasn't even at its peak. By the old methods, the methods every trapper and hunter in the territory knew by heart, he had maybe 36 hours before these fish would begin to turn. 48 if he was lucky, and the nights stayed cold. After that, they'd be fit only for coyote bait. He'd seen it happen before. Watched good men lose entire catches to the warm breath of spring, seen them grow thin and desperate by July when the hunting turned scarce and the fish runs were long past. Some made it through. Others didn't. The mountains kept their own accounting. He thought of Martha, his wife of 3 years. Back at the cabin 2 miles downstream, thought of the child she carried, due come August. A man with a family couldn't afford to watch food rot, couldn't afford to let Providence's gifts slip through his fingers like so much river water. Thomas hoisted the catch onto his shoulders, the wet hemp rope cutting into his neck, and began the walk home. The fish slapped against his back with each step, still fresh, still good, still temporary. As he walked, he ran through everything he knew about preservation. The knowledge felt thin as birch bark. Everyone smoked fish. Everyone knew you gutted them, split them, hung them over a slow fire. But spring was the wrong season for smoking. The air was too damp, the wood too green. The smoke never got hot enough or thick enough, and the fish drew flies before they could dry properly. He'd seen it turn into a maggoty mess more than once. Some men tried salting, but salt was currency out here, worth its weight in beaver pelts. A man could trade 5 pounds of salt for a good rifle. Using it for fish preservation was a rich man's luxury, and Thomas Brennan was not a rich man. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun had heated the valley enough that he could smell the pine sap starting to run. Martha met him at the door, one hand on her swollen belly, her eyes going wide at the size of his catch. She was a practical woman, daughter of a Missouri trapper, and she knew fish as well as he did. She also knew the problem without him saying a word. They spent the afternoon gutting the catch, working side by side at the rough-hewn table Thomas had built their first winter. The knife work was meditative, slit from vent to gills, pull the innards, scrape the bloodline from the spine. The guts went into a bucket for the garden. Nothing was wasted out here. Nothing could be. As they worked, Martha talked about the Shoshone woman who'd helped her when she'd taken sick last winter. Her name was Laughing Bird, though Martha called her Sarah. She'd shown Martha how to make a tea from willow bark that took away the fever, how to find the first greens of spring before the snow had fully melted. She knew things, Martha said, old things, things that worked when the new ways failed. Thomas nodded, only half listening, his mind still turning over the problem. He'd built a small smokehouse the previous fall, following the design every frontiersman knew. A simple log structure chin high, with a fire pit at one end and racks for hanging meat or fish at the other. The smoke was supposed to drift through, cool and steady, preserving while it dried. But he'd already tried smoking trout in spring. The results had been disastrous. The fish had cooked instead of cured, turned soft and sour within days. And the flies. God, the flies came in clouds, laying their eggs faster than he could brush them away. By the third day, he'd had to bury the entire batch. The memory of that waste still stung. That had been food. That had been survival. Turned to rot because he'd followed the conventional wisdom. That evening, after they'd packed the cleaned fish in damp moss inside a barrel, Thomas walked upstream to where the river bent against a limestone bluff. He often came here to think. The sound of the water had a way of clearing his mind, and he needed clarity now. The fish in the barrel might last 2 days, 3 if he was lucky. After that, the spring warmth would have its way with them. He sat on a flat rock and watched the river work, watched how it carved around the bluff, how it had hollowed out a deep pool in the limestone's shadow. The water there looked almost black, even in the late afternoon light. Cold water, deep water, protected from the sun by the curve of the cliff. He'd pulled fish from that pool in August, and they'd been cold to the touch, even when the rest of the river ran warm. Something about that observation stuck in his mind, like a burr, cold, constant cold. Not the temporary cold of snow or ice that melted away when the sun climbed high, but permanent cold, the kind that lived in the bones of the earth itself. He thought about the root cellar at the cabin, dug 6 feet down into the hillside. It stayed cool even in summer, cool enough to keep vegetables from spoiling, but not cold enough for fish. Not in spring, when the earth was still throwing off winter's chill unevenly. What he needed was colder than a cellar, colder than a smokehouse, colder than anything the April sun could reach. He sat there as the light faded, turning it over in his mind, until Martha called him home for supper. That night, lying on their corn-husk mattress, with Martha's breathing deep, and even beside him, Thomas stared at the roof beams and let his mind wander through everything he'd learned in 15 years on the frontier. He thought about the winter he'd spent with a crow hunting party, how they'd stored meat in snow caves, dug deep into the north-facing slopes where the sun never reached, meat that stayed frozen solid until spring. He thought about the French-Canadian voyageurs he'd met at Rendezvous, how they talked about ice houses back in Montreal, buildings packed with winter ice that kept food cold through August. But he had no ice house, no way to store winter ice through spring. And the snow was already gone from the valley. He thought about the limestone caves he'd explored in these mountains. Some of them breathed cold air, even in summer, air that made your breath fog and raise gooseflesh on your arms. The old Shoshone told stories about such places, said they were entrances to the spirit world, places where the cold of the earth heart came up to meet the warm world of the living. The trappers just called them ice caves and avoided them, because they were dark and dangerous and offered nothing worth the risk. Nothing except cold. Permanent, unchanging cold. Thomas sat up in the darkness, careful not to wake Martha. His heart was beating faster. There was a cave system about 5 miles north of here, up where Douglas Creek carved through the limestone ridge. He'd been inside once, years ago, following a wounded elk. The entrance was small, barely big enough for a man to squeeze through, but it opened into a larger chamber beyond. And he remembered the cold. It had shocked him, that sudden drop in temperature. He'd seen his breath fog in the lantern light, seen ice on the walls in September. The elk had died in there, and he'd left it. The effort of hauling it out hadn't seemed worth it at the time. He'd never gone back. But now that memory glowed in his mind like a coal, a natural cold room, a place untouched by spring or summer or fall, a place where winter lived year-round in the deep places of the earth. Could it work? Could he store fish in a cave the way the crow stored meat in snow caves? The idea felt both obvious and impossible. Obvious because it made perfect sense. The cold would keep the fish from spoiling. Impossible because no one did it. He'd never heard of any trapper or hunter storing food in caves, which meant either no one had thought of it or they'd thought of it. And there was a reason it didn't work. The next morning, Thomas told Martha his idea over breakfast. She listened the way she always did, giving him her full attention while her hands stayed busy with the morning bread. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Sarah told me her people used to store food in cold caves in the old days, back before they had to move so much. She said there were rules about it, ways to do it right." Thomas leaned forward. "What kind of rules?" Martha shrugged. She didn't say exactly, just that the cold wasn't enough by itself. The food had to breathe, but not too much. Had to be wrapped, but not sealed. The cave had to be the right kind of cave. Not all cold caves worked. Some of them had bad spirits that made the food turn strange. Thomas nodded slowly. Bad spirits likely meant bad air. Some caves had pockets of gas that could kill a man or spoil food. He'd heard stories. But some caves were good. Clean air, steady cold. The Douglas Creek cave had felt clean. He'd breathed easy in there, no sulfur smell, no thickness to the air, just cold and dark and still. He spent that morning checking his fish barrel. The moss had kept them cool overnight, but they were starting to smell. Not rotten yet, but getting there. The sweet mineral smell of fresh trout was turning sour at the edges. He had maybe another day. He made his decision. By noon he was heading north with a pack full of cleaned fish, wrapped in wet birch bark, a coil of rope, 2 lanterns, and his hunting knife. The walk to Douglas Creek took him through country he knew well, pine forest giving way to aspen groves, then up into the rocky draws where the limestone showed through like old bones. He found the cave entrance exactly where he remembered it, a dark crack in the hillside hidden behind a curtain of wild rose and serviceberry. The bushes had grown thicker over the years, but the opening was still there, still breathing cold air that made the spring leaves shiver. Thomas lit his first lantern and squeezed through. The passage was tight, scraping his shoulders, then suddenly opened into the main chamber. The temperature dropped so fast it took his breath. His lantern light pushed back the darkness, revealing a space about 20 feet across and twice as long. The ceiling was high enough to stand in most places, dipping down in others. And everywhere, ice. Not thick ice, not the kind that built up in winter and melted in spring, but a thin glaze of permanent ice that crusted the walls and formed strange columns where water had dripped and frozen over countless years. The air itself felt frozen. When Thomas breathed out, his breath hung in a cloud that barely moved. No wind in here, no air current at all. Just still, cold air that felt like winter preserved in stone. He walked deeper into the cave, lantern held high, examining the space with new eyes, not as a shelter or a hiding place, but as a storage room, a natural ice house built by the earth itself. The floor was mostly dry, covered in limestone dust and small rocks. The walls wept in places, thin trickles of water that froze before they could fall more than a few inches. In the deepest part of the cave, farthest from the entrance, he found a natural shelf in the rock about waist high. He set his lantern down and tested the shelf. Solid limestone, dry, cold enough that his hand went numb touching it. This was it. This was where he'd store the fish. But Martha's words came back to him. The food had to breathe, but not too much. Had to be wrapped, but not sealed. He couldn't just pile fish on a rock and hope for the best. He thought about everything he knew about food preservation. Smoking worked because it dried the fish and coated them with compounds that kept bacteria from growing. Salting worked because salt drew out moisture and created an environment where nothing could live. But in a cold cave, the enemy wasn't bacteria. It was air and moisture. Too much air would dry the fish to leather. Too little would let them mold. Too much moisture would make them slimy. Too little would crack the flesh. He needed something that would protect the fish but let them breathe. something that would maintain their moisture without making them wet. He thought about birch bark, the same birch bark the Shoshone used for baskets and containers. Birch bark was nearly waterproof, but it breathed. Air could move through it slowly, but water couldn't. And it was naturally antimicrobial. He'd seen meat wrapped in birch bark last longer than meat wrapped in cloth or leather. Thomas unwrapped one of his test fish and examined it in the lantern light. Still good, still firm. He wrapped it carefully in a fresh piece of birch bark, leaving the ends open, and placed it on the limestone shelf. Then he did the same with 2 more fish. He'd give it 3 days. If the fish were still good when he came back, he'd know this could work. If they'd turned, well, he'd only wasted 3 fish finding out. As he turned to leave, something made him look up. The ceiling of the cave was festooned with thin stalactites, and in the lantern light they glowed like frozen water. Frozen time. This cave had been here for thousands of years, would be here for thousands more. The cold in these stones was older than his people's presence on this continent, older than the Shoshone, older than the last ice age that had carved these mountains into their current shape. He was just borrowing it, just asking the earth to share its endless winter with him for a season. 3 days later, Thomas returned to the cave with his heart in his throat. If the fish had spoiled, he was back where he'd started. Worse, actually, because he'd wasted 3 more days while the spring run continued, and his barrel of fish grew steadily more questionable. He squeezed through the entrance and felt that shocking drop in the temperature. Lit his lantern, walked to the shelf. The birch bark bundles lay exactly where he'd left them. He picked up the first one with hands that trembled slightly. Unwrapped it. The fish looked exactly as it had 3 days ago, still firm, still pink, still smelling of nothing but cold stone and river water. He pressed his thumb into the flesh. It was firm, not mushy, not soft. He brought it close to his face and inhaled. Nothing, no hint of rot, no sour smell, just fish, fresh fish. He checked the other 2. Same result. 3 days in a cold cave wrapped in birch bark, and they were as fresh as the day he'd caught them, maybe fresher, because the cold had firmed the flesh. Thomas sat back on his heels and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It worked. His crazy, impossible idea actually worked. He felt a surge of something that was part triumph and part terror. Because now he had to commit. Now he had to bring all his fish up here, store them in this dark hole in the ground, and trust that what worked for 3 days would work for 3 weeks. Trust that he wasn't missing something crucial. Trust that the cave wouldn't betray him. But he thought about winter coming. Thought about Martha and the baby. Thought about having food stored when others went hungry. And he made his choice. Over the next week, Thomas worked like a man possessed. He caught fish during the day, cleaned them in the evening, and hiked up to the cave at night to lay them out on the growing racks he'd built from saplings and rope. He'd expanded his storage system. The natural shelf had been a good start, but he needed more space. So he'd built simple frames that rested on the cave floor and rose in tiers like bunks in a cramped cabin. Each tier was just far enough apart to let air circulate. Each fish was wrapped in birch bark, with the ends open, as he'd done with the test batch. He'd learned quickly that placement mattered. Fish stored near the entrance didn't keep as well. The temperature was less stable there, fluctuating with the outside air. But fish stored in the deepest part of the cave, where the cold was absolute and eternal, stayed perfect. He'd also learned that he couldn't stack the birch bark bundles too close together. They needed space between them. Needed air to move, even cold, still air. When he'd tried packing them tight to save space, the fish in the middle had started to develop a slick, unpleasant texture, but spaced properly with an inch or 2 between each bundle. They stayed firm and clean. Martha thought he was losing his mind. He'd come home each night exhausted, smelling of cave and fish and birch bark, his clothes damp from cave moisture, his hands cracked from the constant cold. But when he brought home fish from the first batches, fish that were 2 weeks old and still perfect, she stopped questioning, started helping instead. She showed him how to weave birch bark into better containers, taught him the Shoshone method of creating bark boxes that were rigid enough to protect the fish but still allowed airflow. Together they processed the continued bounty of the spring run. By the time the spawn was finished and the trout had returned to their normal habits, Thomas had nearly 200 fish stored in his cave. 200 fish that would have been impossible to preserve by any conventional method. Other trappers and settlers in the valley had caught plenty during the spawn, but they'd lost most of it. Some had tried smoking and ended up with half-spoiled mush that barely qualified as food. Others had used their precious salt, but ran out after the first dozen fish. A few had tried making a Indian-style salmon pemmican, pounding the fish with berries and fat, but spring fish weren't fatty enough, and the results were disappointing. Most had simply eaten fish 3 times a day until they were sick of it, then watched the rest rot. When they asked Thomas how he'd managed to keep his catch, he was vague, told them he had a good cold storage setup, didn't mention the cave, not because he wanted to keep it secret, but because he knew how it would sound. Storing food in a hole in the ground? In a cave? They'd think he was crazy, would tell him about bears or mountain lions that denned in caves, about bad air and cave-ins, about all the reasons it couldn't possibly work. So he kept quiet and let them wonder. But word spread anyway. By June, when game was scarce and the heat had settled into the valley, Thomas's cabin was the only one still eating fresh-tasting fish. Not dried, not salted, not smoked to leather, just cold-preserved, firm and clean, and nutritious. Martha made fish stews and fish fried in bear grease and fish baked in clay. The baby growing in her belly stayed strong. She didn't lose weight like some of the other expectant mothers in the scattered settlement. She had protein, had fat from the fish, had food security in a place where security was always temporary. It was old Henry Cartwright who finally got the truth out of Thomas. Henry was a grizzled trapper in his 60s, one of the first white men to explore this region. He'd survived things that would have killed lesser men, and he had a nose for useful knowledge. He showed up at Thomas's cabin one evening in July with a bottle of whiskey and a direct question. "How are you keeping fish fresh? And don't give me that cold storage nonsense. I know every cold spring and root cellar in this valley, and none of them work this well in summer." Thomas looked at the old man's weathered face and made a decision. If anyone would understand, it would be Henry. So he told him about the cave, about the birch bark wrapping, about the racks and the spacing and the careful temperature management, about checking the fish every few days, rotating them, removing any that showed signs of spoiling before they could affect the others, about learning through trial and error which parts of the cave were coldest, which had the best airflow, which stayed driest. Henry listened without interrupting, taking small sips of whiskey and nodding occasionally. When Thomas finished, the old trapper was quiet for a long minute. Then he said, "You know what you've done? You've invented a natural refrigerator. Same principle as them ice houses back east, but using the Earth's own cold instead of stored ice. I'll be damned. That's smart." "That's Indian smart?" Thomas felt his face heat. "Martha's friend Sarah said her people used to do something similar." Henry nodded. "Wouldn't surprise me. Indians been living out here thousands of years. They figured out what works. We're just now catching up." He took another sip of whiskey. "You planning to keep this to yourself?" Thomas shook his head. "No. If others want to learn, I'll show them. But you want to make sure it works first," Henry finished. "Make sure you're not just lucky. Make sure there's not some problem that'll show up come fall." "Exactly," Henry smiled. "Smart. Very smart. Well, I'll tell you what. I know a few caves that might work. Been exploring these mountains since before you were born. If your system works through summer and into fall, come winter, I'll help you scout other locations. We'll map them. Turn this knowledge into something the whole territory can use." Thomas nodded slowly. That felt right. Knowledge wasn't meant to be hoarded, not out here. Out here, knowledge shared was the difference between communities that thrived and communities that failed. By August, Thomas's cave storage had become something of a legend in the valley. When Martha gave birth to a healthy boy, weighing heavy and strong, the other women attributed it partly to her steady diet of fish. When Thomas guided two skeptical settlers up to see his setup, they stood in the cave's cold darkness with their mouths hanging open, watching their breath fog in August heat. Watching Thomas unwrap a fish that had been stored for 3 months and looked as fresh as if it had been caught that morning. One of them, a man named Samuel from Ohio, kept touching the cave walls like he couldn't believe they were real. "This is colder than any root cellar I've ever felt. Colder than ice in a well." Thomas nodded. "The earth's cold, deep cold. It doesn't go away just because summer comes. You just have to find it." The other settler, Michael, was more practical. "How many fish can you store in here?" Thomas gestured around the chamber. "With the racks I've built, maybe 300. But there are bigger caves, deeper caves, caves that could store fish for an entire settlement if we found them and set them up right." Samuel shook his head wonderingly. "And you just figured this out? Just thought of it?" Thomas smiled. "I observed, saw how cold this cave was, remembered how the Shoshone talked about cold storage, combined different pieces of knowledge until something new emerged. That's not genius, that's just paying attention. But it was more than that, and they all knew it. It was the willingness to try something that sounded crazy, the willingness to test an idea even when conventional wisdom said it wouldn't work, the willingness to learn from both success and failure, adjusting and refining until the system worked properly. By September, 3 other families had found suitable caves and started their own cold storage systems, guided by Thomas's experience. Not all caves worked. Some were too shallow, warming up as summer progressed. Others had moisture problems or poor airflow, but the caves that worked magnificently. They became communal resources, carefully managed and shared according to need. The success spread. As trappers moved through the territory carrying news from settlement to settlement, word of the cave storage method traveled with them. Some people thought it was nonsense until they saw it with their own eyes. Others tried it and failed because they didn't understand the nuances, the careful balance of temperature, moisture, and airflow. But those who learned the method properly found themselves with a new tool in their survival arsenal. A way to preserve protein without salt or smoke or ice. A way to extend the bounty of a spring spawn or a good fall fishing season into the lean months of winter. Thomas became known as something of an expert. People would come to him with questions. How do you know if a cave is suitable? How long can fish really last? What about other foods? Could you store meat this way? Vegetables, cheese? He'd answer what he could from his own experience and admit what he didn't know. The truth was, he was still learning, still discovering new wrinkles in the method. He'd found that different fish required slightly different treatment. Trout with their delicate flesh needed careful handling and shorter storage times. Larger fish like sturgeon, when he was lucky enough to catch one, could last even longer because their denser flesh held up better. He'd learned that the birch bark wrapping was crucial, but it had to be changed periodically. After a few weeks, the bark would start to break down, losing its protective properties, so he'd rotate through fresh bark, unwrapping and rewrapping his stores every 3 weeks or so. He'd learned that some herbs helped. Wrapping the fish with wild sage or mountain mint seemed to extend their freshness, adding a subtle flavor while providing additional antimicrobial protection. He'd learned this from Sarah, Laughing Bird, who'd shared more of her people's knowledge when she saw that Thomas was serious about learning, not just taking. She'd told him about how her grandmother's grandmother would store not just fish, but game meat in the high caves during summer, making it possible for the tribe to stay in good hunting grounds rather than constantly moving to follow food sources. The caves had been sacred spaces, she said, places where the earth shared its gifts with those who knew how to ask respectfully. Thomas took that to heart. He never treated his cave like a mere tool. He kept it clean, removed any waste, made sure his presence didn't disturb the natural balance of the space. It felt right, treating the cave with respect. Felt like he was a guest in a place that existed long before him and would exist long after. The first winter after his discovery proved the worth of his method beyond any doubt. Snow came early that year, heavy and deep. Hunting became nearly impossible. The game had moved to lower elevations beyond the reach of the scattered settlers. By January, several families were going hungry. But Thomas's family had fish. The cave, buried under 6 feet of snow, was even colder now. The fish stored there had lasted beautifully. Some batches were 8 months old and still edible, still nourishing. Thomas shared what he could, though he was careful not to deplete his own stores too much. Martha and little Henry needed food too, but he gave enough that no one in their immediate area starved. And come spring, when the trout ran again, Thomas had new students, men and women who'd watched their families go hungry while his had not, who'd seen the value of this strange, unlikely knowledge, who wanted to learn. Thomas taught them freely, took them to the Douglas Creek Cave and showed them every detail of his system, the placement of the racks, the importance of airflow, the art of the birch bark wrapping, the need to check the stores regularly to remove any fish that showed signs of turning before they could contaminate the others. He showed them how to test a cave's suitability, how to feel the quality of the cold, steady, and absolute versus cold that fluctuated with the seasons, how to look for ice formations that indicated permanent chill, how to test the air quality by watching how a candle burned. Good air meant a good cave. Bad air, air that made a candle gutter and smoke, meant danger. Some of his students found excellent caves, better than his in some ways, larger, more accessible, with multiple chambers that could be used for different storage needs. The knowledge spread through the territory like seeds on the wind. By the time Thomas was 35, 8 years after his first experiment, natural cold storage was an established practice across much of the Green River Valley and beyond. Trappers in the high country used mountain caves to store meat during summer. Fishing communities along the rivers used riverside caves to preserve the spring runs. Settler families used any suitable cave they could find to extend the life of their food stores. It had become part of the survival toolkit, passed from person to person, refined and improved with each telling. Some folks added their own innovations. One trapper figured out that storing fish in rendered bear fat created an even better seal, keeping them fresh for up to a year. A Shoshone elder shared a technique of coating fish in clay before storing them, creating a moisture-proof barrier that worked even better than birch bark for long-term storage. A settler woman discovered that caves, which had been used for storage, developed a beneficial environment over time, almost like the caves themselves learned to preserve food. The cold walls would develop a thin coating of beneficial mold that actually helped keep spoilage at bay. Knowledge built on knowledge. The specific trick became general wisdom, and that wisdom saved lives. Yet even as the method spread and evolved, Thomas noticed something troubling. The younger generation, the children born on the frontier who'd never known a different way, took it for granted. To them, cave storage was just what you did. They didn't understand the desperation that had driven its discovery, didn't appreciate the careful observation and willingness to try the seemingly impossible that had made it work. One day, Thomas's son Henry, now a tall boy of 14, asked him a question that stayed with him. "Pa, when you first thought of using the cave, how did you know it would work?" Thomas had considered his answer carefully. "I didn't know. That's the point. I observed something, formed an idea, and tested it. could have failed completely. But I was willing to try because the alternative was worse. Henry had frowned. But it seems so obvious now. Cold keeps food fresh. Caves are cold. Of course it works. That's when Thomas understood what was being lost. The knowledge of the method had been preserved, yes, but the knowledge of how to find such methods, how to observe and experiment and combine different wisdoms into something new, that was already fading. The willingness to look foolish, the courage to try something no one else had tried, the ability to learn from both success and failure. Those were the real lessons, and they were harder to pass on than any specific technique. So Thomas started teaching differently. When young people came to learn about cave storage, he'd start by asking them questions. What problems did their grandparents face? How did they solve them? What worked and what didn't? What could they observe in nature that might teach them something? He'd take them to the cave, yes, but he'd also take them to places where the method had failed. Show them caves that looked promising but had proven unsuitable. Explain why, share his early mistakes. The fish he'd lost to poor wrapping. The time he'd stored fish too close to a sulfur seep and ruined an entire batch. The importance of not just following rules but understanding principles. He wanted them to understand that this method wasn't handed down from on high. It was discovered through observation, desperation, and the willingness to combine different sources of knowledge, native and newcomer, into something that worked for this specific landscape. And more importantly, he wanted them to know they could do the same thing, could observe their own challenges, draw on their own mix of knowledge, and find their own solutions. The cave storage method was just one example. There would be other challenges. Other problems that seemed impossible until someone paid close enough attention to nature's hints and had the courage to try something different. By the time Thomas was an old man himself, grizzled as Henry Cartwright had been when they'd shared that bottle of whiskey, the method had spread across the entire Rocky Mountain region. Fur traders used it. Native tribes incorporated it into their traditional practices. Settler communities built their locations around the availability of good storage caves. It had become invisible through its ubiquity, just part of how people survived in the mountains. But Thomas always remembered the terror and exhilaration of those first experiments. The fish wrapped in birch bark sitting on that cold limestone shelf. The return 3 days later with his heart in his throat. The moment of unwrapping and seeing that it had worked, that the impossible was possible. That feeling was what he tried to pass on to anyone who would listen, not just the method, but the mindset behind it, the willingness to observe carefully, the courage to combine knowledge from different sources, the understanding that nature had already solved most survival problems. You just had to pay attention and ask the right questions. The respect for both innovation and tradition. The knowledge that failure was part of learning, not something to be feared, but something to be studied and understood. Look around you, he'd tell young trappers and hunters. Look at how the beaver stores food underwater, how the squirrel caches nuts in multiple locations, how the bear fattens in fall and sleeps through winter. Nature is teaching you all the time. The earth is offering solutions. You just have to be humble enough to learn. The spring run that had started everything came every year, as reliable as the seasons. Thomas always marked it, that surge of silver fish fighting upstream. He'd be out there in the cold water, even in his 70s, pulling trout from his weir. But now his sons and grandsons would be there too, and when they hauled their catch home, they knew exactly what to do. Clean them carefully, wrap them in birch bark with the ends open. Carry them up to the caves that had been prepared and maintained for this purpose. Store them in the deep cold where summer couldn't reach. It had become tradition, but Thomas hoped they understood it was tradition built on observation and experiment, not blind adherence to the old ways. That any tradition worth keeping had once been someone's crazy idea, tested and proven through practical necessity. He thought often about that desperate spring morning when he'd stood in the river with more fish than he could save and no salt or ice to preserve them. How impossible the situation had seemed, how limited his options had appeared, and how the solution had been there all along, breathing cold air from a crack in the hillside, waiting for someone desperate enough and observant enough to notice. That's what survival on the frontier had always been about. Not just enduring the hardships, but seeing the opportunities hidden within them. Not just following the established methods, but being willing to look at old problems with new eyes. Combining the wisdom of those who came before, both native peoples who'd survived here for millennia and fellow settlers learning as they went. Being willing to fail, to adjust, to try again, treating nature not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a teacher to be respected. The knowledge that had kept fish fresh for weeks without salt or ice had done more than preserve food. It had preserved families, had kept communities alive through hard winters, had given people the security to stay in one place and build something lasting rather than constantly moving to follow the food. It had become one thread in the great tapestry of frontier survival, woven in alongside countless other hard-won lessons. But what mattered most to Thomas, lying in bed on cold autumn nights with Martha sleeping beside him, was knowing that the real gift hadn't been the specific method. It had been the demonstration of what was possible when you looked at the world with open eyes and a willingness to learn, when you took the time to observe, when you listened to the knowledge of others, whether they were white trappers or Shoshone elders, when you combined those different wisdoms with your own experience and experimentation, when you were humble enough to fail and persistent enough to try again. The earth had always been offering its gifts. The caves had always been there, holding winter in their stone hearts through summer's heat. The birch trees had always been growing with their antimicrobial bark ready to be harvested. The fish had always been running in spring, providing abundance if only it could be captured and held. What had been missing was the human piece, the observer, the thinker. The person desperate enough and creative enough to put it all together into something that worked. That person could have been anyone. Could have been a native hunter 10,000 years ago. Could have been another white trapper. Could have been a settler woman with hungry children. It happened to be Thomas Brennan on a warm spring morning in 1837, but the story would have been similar regardless. Necessity breeding observation, observation breeding experiment, experiment breeding knowledge, knowledge breeding survival. And that knowledge, once discovered and shared, never really disappeared. It might fade, might be forgotten for a time, but it was always there, waiting to be rediscovered by the next person who looked at an old problem with new eyes, the next person who was willing to try something that sounded crazy, the next person who understood that the frontier's greatest resource wasn't the beaver or the buffalo or the gold in the streams. It was the accumulated wisdom of everyone who'd learned to survive here, shared freely from one to another, building generation by generation into something that made not just survival, but thriving possible. Thomas's contribution had been one technique, one method among thousands that people used to live in the mountains. But he'd always hoped that his real contribution was larger than that, was the example of how such methods were found, the demonstration that careful observation, respectful learning, and persistent experimentation could solve problems that seemed impossible, that the old ways and the new ways didn't have to be in conflict, that wisdom came from many sources and was strengthened when those sources were combined, that nature was always teaching if you learned to pay attention to its lessons. The cave still stood in the hillside above Douglas Creek, breathing its cold breath into the warm air of summer. Thomas's original racks had long since rotted away, replaced by newer, better designs. But the principle remained the same, the earth's cold, carefully borrowed, the birch bark's protection, respectfully used, the fish's nutrition, extended through time by understanding and effort, Other caves had been found and put to use, better caves in some ways. But that first cave, the one where Thomas had placed 3 test fish with trembling hands, remained special. People called it Brennan's Cave now, though Thomas always corrected them when he could. It wasn't his cave, it was the Earth's cave. He'd just been the first white man in this territory to understand how to use it properly. And even that probably wasn't true. Sarah Laughing-Bird had hinted that her people had used that very cave, or others like it, in the generations before they'd been pushed from their traditional territories. Thomas had just rediscovered what had been known before and forgotten in the chaos of displacement and change. That thought humbled him and comforted him in equal measure. Humbled him because it meant he wasn't the genius inventor he was sometimes painted as. Comforted him because it meant this knowledge had deep roots, had proven itself over centuries, was part of the accumulated wisdom of humanity's long struggle to thrive in challenging places. He'd just been a link in that chain, a preserver and adapter of old wisdom to new circumstances. And perhaps if he'd taught well, he'd helped ensure that the chain wouldn't break, that the next generation would understand not just what worked, but how to figure out what worked, how to observe, experiment, learn, and adapt. On his last trip to the cave at 72 years old with winter coming on and his bones feeling it, Thomas stood in that familiar cold darkness and let himself remember the panic of that first spring, the desperation that had driven him to try something no one else thought possible, the terror and hope mixed together in those first days, the joy of discovery, the satisfaction of seeing others benefit from what he'd learned, the pride in watching the knowledge spread and evolve, the deep contentment of knowing he'd added something useful to the world's store of wisdom. But mostly, he remembered the lesson that had driven everything else, the lesson he'd tried so hard to pass on. Pay attention. The world is always teaching. Combine knowledge from every source you can find. Don't let pride or prejudice blind you to good ideas just because they come from unexpected places. Be willing to try things that seem impossible. Be willing to fail. Be willing to learn from both success and failure. Respect nature's patterns because nature has been solving these problems for millions of years. Share what you learn freely because in harsh country, hoarded knowledge is wasted knowledge. That was the real trick, not the cave or the birch bark or the fish, but the mindset that could look at a problem everyone thought unsolvable and find the answer hidden in plain sight. That was the ingenious trick that had kept not just fish fresh for weeks, but communities alive for generations. And as Thomas turned to leave the cave for the last time, his lantern casting long shadows on the frost-covered walls, he offered a quiet thank you to the earth for sharing its cold, to the Shoshone for sharing their wisdom, to the birch trees for sharing their bark, and to the desperation that had forced him to pay attention when attention was all that stood between survival and starvation. The knowledge would continue without him, would evolve and improve, would be passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, would save lives he'd never know about in places he'd never see, and that was exactly as it should be. The frontier had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important was this. Survival was never individual. It was always communal, was always built on the accumulated wisdom of everyone who'd come before, was always strengthened by the willingness to learn from anyone who had something to teach, was always extended by the generosity of those who shared what they'd learned rather than hoarding it. One hunter's ingenious trick had been nothing more than paying attention to the world, learning from all available sources, and having the courage to try something new. But that simple combination, repeated by thousands of people solving thousands of problems, was what made the frontier livable, was what turned a harsh, unforgiving landscape into home. And that knowledge, like the cold in the caves, was permanent, was renewable, would never run out as long as people kept watching, kept learning, kept combining wisdom old and new into solutions that worked for their time and place. The earth kept teaching. People kept learning. And the chain of knowledge, linking past to present to future, stayed unbroken. That was the real story. That was the wisdom worth preserving. That was the gift that one hunter's desperate spring morning had helped to pass forward, and it would keep passing forward as long as people remembered to pay attention.